Hello everyone, today I will be presenting on Mitsuye Endo. Mitsuye Endo was born May 10, 1920 in Sacramento, California to Japanese immigrant parents. Her father worked in a grocery store and her mother was a homemaker, which was a very common American role that women took at the time. Endo was born at a very difficult time for American immigrants. In 1924, the United States passed the Immigration Act, which banned free immigration from many countries, but practically excluded Asian countries, and it established a person quota of about 100 to 200 people per year. This increased much of the social exclusion Japanese Americans faced. By the 1930s, the Great Depression had begun, and Americans faced a long period of economic and agricultural depression. For poor women, the burdens of homemaking were exacerbated by problems of poor sanitation and substandard housing, problems especially for minority women and poor white rural women. While Mitsuye Endo's family was attempting to integrate themselves into American culture, the Great Depression served as a basis for racial inequalities, and oftentimes, minority families like hers suffered the most. Endo, as a woman and a minority, was very fortunate in some ways. She graduated high school in Sacramento and went to a secretarial school, eventually landing a job as a typist at the Department of Motor Vehicles, one of the few jobs that Japanese Americans could actually have without facing so much public scrutiny. Women at the time were often responsible for secretarial and receptionist jobs such as hers, and Endo blended seamlessly into the American lifestyle and the perception of women's roles at the time. In December of 1941, however, Japan attacked the American naval fleet base in Pearl Harbor, killing roughly 2,400 Americans. The attack on Pearl Harbor further increased the anti-Japanese sentiment in America, but even more prominently, it was shown in the West Coast, where Endo and her family were. Within weeks, all Japanese American state employees were dismissed, including Endo. Soon after, Roosevelt issued Executive Order 9066, resulting in the relocation and internment of Japanese Americans. Endo and her family were incarcerated first in Sacramento Relocation Center, and then the Tule Lake War Relocation Center. After the executive order was issued and all these Japanese Americans were let go from their jobs, many of them were unwilling to allow this discrimination to be unchallenged. With the help of the Japanese American Citizens League, James Purcell, one of the only lawyers willing to represent them, began to pursue a lawsuit against Japanese internment. Purcell began to look for the right candidate to represent their case, and Endo seemed to fit perfectly. Endo was an unassuming woman who had never been to Japan, did not speak Japanese, and had a brother in the military. She soon became the lead plaintiff in a case against the government. Purcell filed a writ of habeas corpus lawsuit against the incarceration of Americans of Japanese ancestry and demanded their release on the accounts that they were all law-abiding citizens, no charges had actually been officially made against them, and they were being unlawfully detained and held against their will with gun towers threatening to shoot them should they choose to leave. This lawsuit was originally dismissed, but Purcell appealed it and it eventually was led to the Supreme Court. Through this whole process, Endo remained in the camp. At one point, the government offered her an opportunity to be released if she dropped the case, the only condition being she could never return to the West Coast. She refused, despite the fact she had no plans to return to the West Coast after internment. The reason this is so important is because it showcases that her case really presented a serious challenge to the policies and the executive order at the time. While there were other male-led cases before hers arguing against anti-Japanese policies as well, up until this point, no case served as a real threat in challenging the constitutionality of Executive Order 9066. The case eventually was ruled unanimously in Endo's favor. Her case is the driving force in the closure of Japanese internment camps. A day before the ruling of her case, Roosevelt received a tip on the Supreme Court's decision and announced the release of all loyal Japanese American citizens from camps. Endo was the lead plaintiff in the only one case against the U.S. for illegally holding Japanese Americans who were deemed as loyal citizens. No cases of the Supreme Court rulings have admitted the wrongdoing of Japanese internment, but this case called into question the government and their judgment and forced them to recognize some of the unconstitutionality of mass internment. Mitsuye Endo was this young Japanese-American woman standing at the forefront of this major case in a time when women were still expected to play smaller societal and political roles. Endo challenged this misconception of women being more submissive and less than men, and did not back down or waver in her determination to overcome this larger societal issue, an issue that was less about her own freedom and more about the freedom of all her people. Her case asked people to question the decision of the executive branch, much like it teaches us to do now, and to not perpetuate the discrimination our political leaders may impose. America is still full of racial and gender inequalities, but her legacy teaches people today that you have the right to fight for your rights. She bravely stood up against the quote-unquote man to make sure no other American minorities would have to suffer through racial injustices to the extent that Japanese Americans faced in the 1940s.